Hey everybody, welcome to the Perspectrum. This is Michael Bloom.
This is Nathan Seelove.
And welcome back for our old listeners, and welcome for the first time for any newbies out there. Today we'll be discussing a few big topics. We'll talk about DACA. We'll talk about the impeachment update. We'll give a little bit of a primary update, talking specifically about Elizabeth Warren's healthcare plan and some additional weaknesses we found. And we'll do this all from the theme this week of the burden of proof.
Yep. So let's talk about the burden of proof. And I want to talk about this in sort of three different levels. The first one is as a matter of logical fallacy. So the burden of proof fallacy happens when someone shifts the burden of proof that should rightfully fall with themselves to another person. So say I were to walk up to Michael and I were to say, "Hey, Michael, got this invisible gremlin right here who's right next to me, and he whispers in my ear, and he tells me everything about morality, and that's who I get my morality from."
I don't see any gremlin. I don't think that's real.
Well, that's because he's invisible. He's invisible.
Well, prove to me that there's a gremlin there.
Prove he's not there. Can you prove he's not there?
And that is burden of proof shifting.
Yeah, exactly. So when you propose something that in a state of nature is assumed to not exist or to not be real or to not be valid, the burden is on you to prove that it is true. So the automatic assumption when anybody proposes anything should be, this is bullcrap until proven otherwise. Mm-hmm. So that's the logical fallacy aspect of the burden of proof. So,
and if you think about like that concept, it's really fundamental to knowledge making. Like if you think about like what the project, like the scientific project is, it is the process of bringing skepticism to new discoveries and requiring that making new arguments about what is the case in the world, meet a really high standard and overcome the status quo of disbelief, of skepticism.
Yeah, and when I say like the neutral state is to not know anything, what I mean is, when you're born, you don't know anything. Mm-hmm. Like you have to be taught things. But in order for those things to be taught to you, they have to, in a factually honest way, they have to be proved rather than assumed that the burden of proof is on you to discount everything. Basically, if someone presents you something and doesn't give you any evidence, you don't need evidence in order to just dismiss it.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Yeah. So that's the logical fallacy aspect of it. Mm-hmm. So let's talk about the legal aspect of it. Michael, this is more your thing?
Yeah, sure. So you've probably, in watching crime shows, heard about like the burden of proof in the criminal context. So if a prosecutor is bringing a case against a defendant, the defendant is innocent until proven guilty, which is essentially saying that the burden of proof is on the prosecutor.
Yeah, beyond a reasonable doubt.
Yeah, so that's the standard. So the burden of proof is accompanied in logical cases and legal cases with a threshold. And the threshold is really important. That's the point beyond which you have proved your case. So in the logical concept or the logical context, you would have to bear your burden of proof and overcome the threshold of, like reasonability or logic, or probably something along the lines of like 51%, more likely than not. That's the same threshold or standard as would be in a civil trial, where it just has to be more likely than not that a wrong occurred. But in a criminal trial, it has to be beyond a reasonable doubt. So that's often put in the context of like 99% certain. Now, important to note as we go through talking about things like impeachment or things like different lawsuits, the burden of proof shifts as you make your way through the legal system. So if a plaintiff, which is the name for someone who brings a lawsuit in the civil context, so like someone who sues somebody else, if a plaintiff brings a lawsuit, the burden of proof is on them to prove their case. Now, if the plaintiff receives a favorable judgment, so the judge or jury determines that they are correct and are entitled to damages, if the defendant appeals the case, then the burden of proof is on them because the court defers to the lower court's opinion. So you'll often see that in the case of like a United States Supreme Court decision. You'll often see that if they don't overturn the lower court's decision, they remand the decision or they affirm it. So remanding is when they send it back down to the lower court. Affirming it is saying, yep, the lower court was good. We defer to their opinion. We're not going to overturn it. And so like that's based fundamentally in the idea of the burden of proof.
Yeah. And that can shift during other procedures such as an impeachment proceeding,
yes,
which
definitely.
we will get to a little bit later. So another aspect that I think is important to talk about with burden of proof is on a philosophical level. So on a philosophical level, when we talk about burden of proof, when it comes to making decisions about how society should function, what changes we should make in society, it's often made with the understanding that the neutral is the status quo, and therefore anything that deviates from that status quo or any attempts to deviate from the status quo, there needs to be proof that that is the right thing to do. Mm-hmm. So the burden of proof is not to say that the status quo is good and to defend why the status quo is good, but the burden of proof is instead on any changes you make to the status quo need to be proven beyond a reasonable doubt that it is the ideal thing to do or that that's the way you should go about doing it. And if you can't provide enough proof for that, then it doesn't matter how flawed you might think that the status quo is, you don't make the change.
Yeah. And the point about thresholds probably comes into account when you talk about how good or bad the status quo is. If the status quo is terrible murder and corruption, it's a pretty low threshold to say that something else is more likely than not going to be better than that. Yeah. But if the status quo is a prosperous and growing society and economy, you might have to a relatively higher bar in order to significantly modify the system.